Hello, I want to welcome you to this panel today on the emerging global health crisis of non-communicable diseases. And we have a very distinguished panel, as always, here at the Council to discuss the matter. And they're going to talk about a task force, which I didn't know this. The Council does a bunch of reports all the time, issuing all sorts of relevant and important information. But this is, of the 72 task force reports that the Council has published, this is the first one on global health. So it gives you an indication of just how important the issue that we're discussing today is. To my immediate left is Tom Donlin. He is vice chair at O'Melveny in Washington. He's returned to the firm for the fourth time after serving in the Obama administration, most notably as National Security Advisor, responsible, as you can imagine, for steering the administration's foreign policy, intelligence, and military efforts. President Obama was quoted as saying that he was the most effective national security advisor our country has ever had. Not a bad endorsement from your boss, the Commander-in-Chief. A leading national security expert with deep experience, of course, in global strategy, cybersecurity, financial services. Mr. Donlin has a golden Rolodex, perhaps even a platinum one, in fact. Because he has served as the president's personal emissary on a number of missions to different world leaders from China to Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. Tom has advised 3 presidents, beginning with President Carter. He was an assistant secretary of state as well in the Clinton administration. And he is also back at O'Melveny working on the firm's public interest and pro bono initiatives. So he's here, obviously, doing the work of the angels. Barbara Byrne is to his left. She is vice chair in investment banking at Barclays, responsible for leading the firm's relationships with a diverse group of blue chip Fortune 100 corporate clients, including GE, IBM, US Steel, Microsoft, and others, of course. Byrne joined Barclays from Lehman Brothers, where during her very distinguished 28-year career, she became the first and only woman to achieve a vice chair position in Lehman's 158-year history. Just a couple of career highlights relevant to today's discussion. In 2007, she led teams advising the $62 billion spinoff of Kraft and later Philip Morris International, as well as GE on their $11 billion sale of its plastics division. To her left is Tom Boyke. Tom is a senior fellow for global health, economics, and development here at the Council. He's also an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown, as well as a consultant to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Prior to coming to the Council, he was at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where he held negotiations for pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, and medical technologies to the U.S. Republic of Korea Free Trade Agreement. We were talking about Seoul a lot earlier, dishing in the back. And he represented USTR in the negotiations with China on the safety of food and drug imports. He was also, again, relevant to today's discussion, a Fulbright scholar to South Africa, where he worked as the staff attorney to the AIDS Law Project on treatment access issues related to HIV and AIDS. Obviously, health policy is an important part of his portfolio and why he's here today, because we're going to talk. Despite the fact that my business gives so much breathless attention to tropical diseases like Ebola and super viruses and et cetera, it is not the exotic parasites or the tropical viruses that are of pressing concern in today's global health perspective. Really, we're talking about the threat and the crisis of non-communicable diseases, from the increase in the risk of premature death being death before the age of 60. We're talking about problems that have been intransigent in our culture: obesity, cardiovascular disease, preventable cancers, adult onset diabetes. What we have found in this task force is that there are cheap, affordable, and very effective preventions, and that's part of why we're here to talk today. But I want to start off with Tom. You know, we discussed how this is the first task force report on health. Why is the Council, when it should be counting missiles and dealing with terrorist threats, talking about obesity and cardiovascular disease?
Thanks, Juju, and nice to be here with everybody. And as you said, it was an unusual task force for the Council, and it was, I think it's been 72 reports since 1995, and this was the first one on global health. And it was an extraordinary group of people as well, from a multidisciplinary group of fields. That was the question we asked ourselves at the beginning. So Mitch Daniels and I co-chaired this task force. And the first meetings were on the topic that you asked about, which is why is the Council on Foreign Relations doing this? What are the U.S. interests involved? If we identify U.S. interests, what can the United States do about this? What can the United States do about this in terms of its resources available? How effective can it be, and what sort of time frame? Those were the very questions, and we didn't presuppose any answers.
And Mitch Daniels, you were saying, was quite skeptical.
Yeah, I think there were a number of people who were skeptical, and so we decided as a group that this would be a data-driven exercise, that we would go where the evidence led us and come to the conclusions that the evidence took us to. You know, and I've been on a number of task forces. In many cases, they don't abide by the old Daniel Patrick Moynihan maxim that you're entitled to your own opinions and not your own facts. There's a lot of opinion in foreign policy and national security. Here, it really was quite unusual that we really did really go where the data took us. And indeed, if you look at the report, it is really full of data. And in addition to the printed report, there's an online annex with analysis, methodological explanations, and country-by-country reviews of what the data told us about various threats in those countries. Now, on the U.S. interest, one is that, as you said correctly, non-communicable diseases are the biggest threat to the health of populations in low and moderate income countries, by far. Indeed, the World Economic Forum, and as indicated, it concluded in a report that it did, that this was the biggest threat to global development of any threat other than climate change. So it's a major threat to global populations and global development and global economics going forward. The World Economic Forum had published a figure on this indicating that they concluded that the cost in low and moderate income or developing countries was their grouping. The cost would be $21.3 trillion between now and 2030 of non-communicable diseases, an extraordinary amount of money, equal to the entire GDP of these countries last year. So an enormously important issue with respect to these countries' economic future. And from the U.S. interest, of course, that is a U.S. interest. It's a U.S. interest in terms of economic growth and stability around the world, stability of countries that we care deeply about, and the problem is only going to increase because you indicated this is a problem really of younger populations in the low and moderate income countries. Additionally, we determined that this undermines existing U.S. programs. We have had tremendous global health successes in the AIDS area, for example, but the very same populations that we've had tremendous success in saving are populations who are subject to these non-communicable diseases. So we have one platform of successful operations and programs that are underway being directly undercut by the NCD problem. Additionally, more broadly, this really is about U.S. leadership in health. U.S. leadership in health is essential. It has been and is an area in the world that we're looked to. U.S. leadership is essential, and it's very important reputationally for the United States. And last, I would say that we also saw that there were real opportunities here for us to work bilaterally with important countries around the world on this, including countries like China and India. So we determined, again, across a whole range of interests, that the U.S. had significant interest here, and most importantly, and we'll talk about this as we go through this, that there were things that we could do in an affordable way that could show really pretty extraordinary results.
So, Tom, let me skip over Barbara for a second and get you to come in on this discussion about sort of how we got to this place. Why is it that it's trending in this direction, and what did the task force recommend in terms of what the U.S. could do to act as in a leadership role, much like it did in the AIDS crisis?
Great. Well, let me start by thanking Tom and Mitch, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, for great leadership of this task force. And we have a number of task force members here, Barbara being one of them, Nancy Brinker being another, and I want to thank them all for their great service on this task force. So what's new about heart disease, cancer, diabetes being a problem? They've existed in high-income countries for decades now. Why are we concerned about what's happening in low and middle-income countries? And we're concerned because these diseases are increasing in prevalence much faster. in much younger populations and having much worse outcomes than ever happened in developed countries. What are some of the stats behind that? Well, deaths from non-communicable diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory illnesses, increased 53% since 1990 in low and middle income countries. There are more than 8 million deaths that occur in populations 59 and younger from these diseases in low and middle income countries, and the rates are growing worse in the very same countries that we've invested in to address other global health issues. Why is this happening? Well, it starts actually with a bit of good news, which is life expectancies are increasing in low and middle income countries, but most of that increase is driven by improvements in child mortality. So populations are living longer, but you've not seen the same increases in wealth or improvements in health systems that you saw in higher income settings. For instance, when OECD countries hit a median life expectancy age of 59, the GDP per capita in those countries was $4,400. Low-income countries just hit that threshold, and the GDP per capita is $1,000, so significantly lower. You've seen health spending in low and middle-income countries triple over the last 20 years, but it is really low in comparison to high-income settings. All of the governments of sub-Saharan Africa spend as much as Poland on healthcare. If you combined all governments of all low and middle income countries, representing 5.7 billion people, their governments spend less on healthcare than the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Canada combined, representing about 260 million people. At the same time, you've seen unprecedented rates of urbanization and a global integration of consumer markets driving an increase of risk. So with people living longer but without access to preventative care, you are more likely to get an NCD. Without access to chronic care and without the wealth to pay out of pocket, you're more likely to die and become disabled as a result. As Tom mentioned before, these are having huge economic effects in these countries, in some cases some destabilizing effects as well, and this is the reason why it's in the US interest. In terms of just briefly, and I want to make sure we leave time for Barbara because she has a lot of interesting things to say on this topic. But in terms of why we think we can make progress on this, most people don't realize how much progress we have made in high-income countries like the US, despite much higher rates of obesity, much higher rates of unhealthy habits, how we've dramatically cut mortality in under 60 populations. A lot of the interventions around that, really cheap drugs for hypertension, tobacco control, vaccinations around hepatitis B and C, and for HPV, for cervical cancer, things that can be done relatively cheaply but are not broadly available in low and middle income countries, and that's really where we focused.
Well, Barbara, we want to bring you in at this point because not only is the private sector involved as large-scale employers, but also, you know, as actors and partners in the fight against non-communicable diseases. What impact might this have on businesses and what is possible?
Well, I'm sure you're wondering, what is an investment banker doing?
Right.
Focused on this issue. First, I'm sitting here in Mitch's seat. So, but I will tell you that it is critically important to, I deal with very large multinational corporations who are incredibly focused. Right now, most of these guys get 60% of their business from outside the United States. They're US companies. But they're very focused on developing countries. And they're actually very focused. There's an alignment between what we're talking about here on the healthcare issues and what the IBMs and the GEs, and I can go through a large range of companies that are focused on in developing. In particular, if I focus on the sub-Saharan, where and I have familiar with sub-Sahara because we're one of the largest banks, Barclays in Africa, sort of where, you know, think about where the sun shined on the British Empire, and that's where we are. And, but in any event, this issue is critical for that particular population, and when Tom talks about the lack of funding that is available in these countries, the opportunity that I think we have as a nation, that the US has, is to be a convener on this topic. And everybody thinks about, well, where's the funding going to come from? But major corporations will work with you on this to actually create what I would call the new type of /NGO government corporate experience, the shared value type of initiative. And the data in this report, and there was a lot of discussion. I was one of the more interesting, this was not a group that agreed on everything, but there was, which was what made it fun. But the data's fabulous, and the ability to be able to look at what is actually occurring, especially for me looking at the Sub-Sahara, and where could you, especially with technology, for example, HP is very active right now in Africa, very focused on what they can do on healthcare side. So there's a tremendous opportunity to act, and the world needs this type of leadership now, because we're economically, as we all know, extremely fragile. And with the kind of number that we have at a 21.3 trillion, okay, maybe it's off by 10%, who cares? It's whatever that number is, it's huge, and it's lost opportunity, and it's lost human capital, and that human capital, for what is a very minor cost, can be added in, and quite frankly, I think it's critical.
You've heard all three task members talk about the data, and Chris wanted to nudge me and tell everyone that not only are we live streaming today on CFOR.org, but we're also providing a tremendous amount of interactive data on this task force results. So, I would encourage you all to look. One of the things that struck me that you said earlier, Tom, was that, the U.S. really doesn't have a strategy. There is no plan, and yet the task force really found that there are effective, low-cost measures that can go into effect.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. The United States, as we sit here today, does not have in its assistance program or in its global health program a specific effort aimed at addressing the NCD problem. And that's a principal recommendation of the group, obviously, is that the United States should put in place a determined and specific effort and program with respect to NCDs, and it can be done across a range of ways. So one, an overall program. Two, that would inform our interaction with international institutions and organizations in terms of making it a priority, as Barbara said, putting the United States in a leadership role. Third, we'd recommend that it become also a priority in our bilateral relationships with countries around the world, especially these major countries like Brazil and India and China, so the world. So yes, there's not a focused strategy. There should be a focused strategy. And that conclusion is driven not just by the general observations we made about interest, but about, as you said, the fact that it's a big problem and we can have fairly significant impact for not that much money, frankly.
Tom, do you want to delve into some more of the policy aspects of the solutions?
Sure, no, I'm happy to. First, I should say on the data side, I want to make sure that I note the contributions of Chris Murray and his team at the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. It's really their Global Burden of Disease project that provided some of the data for this report and was very generous of them to share it. They shared it pre-publication. It will be coming out in Lancet later this year. It's the type of collaboration you don't often see in global health and is worth acknowledging. In terms of the recommendations, what we looked at is we looked at where are we making progress, but you haven't seen that type of progress happening in low and middle income countries. And we put them in three categories. There are the shovel-ready projects, very similar to our interventions around HIV, the types of things that can be, aren't accessible now in low and middle income countries, but could be for cheap. In many ways, particularly in the current environment of budgetary and fiscal austerity, NCDs are the perfect agenda for austere times, in that many of the interventions exist and could be introduced. To give you those on the shovel-ready projects, we're talking again about cardiovascular disease, which causes 1/4 of all deaths in low and middle income countries, but we've cut dramatically in the US and in other high income countries, despite much higher rates, 4 times the rates of obesity that exist in these countries. Tobacco control, again, working with interested countries on having strong tobacco controls in place. And given a task force that was both bipartisan and had trade officials, development officials, private sector representation, we have very strong recommendations on tobacco control, and they're worth noting. We also look at vaccinations around liver cancer, preventing liver cancer and cervical cancer. That's the first category. Then we looked at the range of activities where we've actually made a lot of progress in high-income countries, but you need more investment to adapt those solutions for low-resource environments. And that's many of the cancers. We've seen a lot of progress in cutting premature mortality rates from breast cancer, from leukemia, from stomach cancer, areas like that. But many of the diagnostic tools involved in treatment aren't necessarily currently adaptable to low-resource settings. And that was really the second category. We also look at diabetes, which the treatment is actually quite cheap, but we need to see more progress on the prevention side, and that's true here, and that's true in low and middle income countries as well. The last category are, we should acknowledge there's a lot we don't know around how to prevent non-communicable diseases. This is particularly true on nutrition, salt reduction, a lot of the behavioral changes that you need to see. We don't have an answer to that. Nobody has an answer really to childhood obesity yet. The rates are much lower in these countries, but they are becoming a problem everywhere. And these areas provide an opportunity for collaboration with developing countries who are having some success, particularly around lower cost models of chronic care, and also the private sector. And I want to acknowledge Barbara's input in this sector is really working with her, that we had a lot of good material come out in this task force report about what would be the role of the private sector.
Barbara, I'm curious if you look at it more through the lens of a workforce issue, or is it a economic impact on trading partners issue, or is it both?
It's actually building from the bottom of the economic pyramid. So yes, that includes workforce, but anytime you have illness, even in a family where there is workforce, there's a dramatic economic impact. So I can give you an example of Zambia, which is a project I know fairly well. So one of the things that appeals to me about this study and the thought of the U.S. being a leader is having the convener. We're working in Zambia to help provide access through a particular project. We're working with GSK, we're working with NGOs on the ground, et cetera. And do we have a legitimate, we being Barclays, do we have a legitimate business interest? Yes, but what would that be? Well, ultimately, if you are alive, you could potentially be a customer of ours, right? So there's a view, when you think it goes that basic, and when you look at the world from, and I'm trained as an economist, as an economics, you must have this part of the world contributing and healthy. And the cost, the intervention cost, what we're doing in Zambia is quite simple. We're actually funding nurse practitioners as an alternative way of providing very basic health care out in the bush. We're doing that together with GSK. I'm sure their motivation is ultimately they can sell pharmaceuticals in. But right now, there's just a government. So it's creating an alternative track. There are a lot of these, what I would call subscale projects occurring all around the world with people who need to have the government impact and need to be able to focus on how to scale and how to deal with those particular issues. And they are mostly NCD type issues. We're not talking about the communicable diseases. Those are clearly a major issue, but setting aside, these are lifestyle issues. So we view it as economic, bottom of the pyramid growth and growing from our perspective in business. I know major international corporations view these markets, developing markets, as where global growth will come from over the next 20 years.
Tom, you talked a lot about the bilateral considerations
Yep.
and working with other governments. That's part of the task force recommendation and building those partnerships. You spent a lot of time meeting with heads of government in the countries that I mentioned in your profile. How much of an appetite do you think there will be among other nations to help support and build a coalition to help?
We hope that the task force report and the data and the conclusions we reach will be an impetus towards raising interest in this issue, number one. Number two, in these strategic dialogues we have with major partners around the world, I always found myself looking for really high impact win-win projects. have had as much interaction probably with the Chinese leadership as anybody in the last 5 or 6 years. And you find on the natural that a lot of those interactions are about problems. You know, we have this problem with you, you have this problem with us. And it's really important to have robust and effective win-win kind of positive agenda projects. And this seems to me to be a perfect example of that, where they have issues in their own populations and issues in populations in countries that they care about around the world. So I do think that it's a real opportunity for increased bilateral cooperation. These are also very important countries in international organizations that deal with these issues.
Tom, can you pick up on the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that might have an impact?
Absolutely. So this is a underfunded area. To give you a sense of how underfunded it is, if you look at the US government Tom mentioned before, there's no established program, and you looked at health spending by year of disability lost. For HIV, that is about $44 per disability adjusted life year. For malaria, that's around $5. Tuberculosis, it's $1.80. And for NCDs, it's 2 cents. It's very low. Most of the funding that has come in this area is really from 2 sources. The first is the World Health Organization, which has been trying to generate interest in this area for some time. And the second is the Bloomberg Foundation, which has contributed significantly to this area, is also a funder of this task force. You've seen increased interest in some areas. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has recently announced more money to do tobacco control in Africa. And there are some interest from the other public-private partnerships that have been working on global health for some time. Steve Davis was another task force member and runs PATH, which is the largest PDP in this area. So I think there is some real space, particularly around the adaptation of technologies that could be used in these environments. That would be a big help in terms of the behavior change or social issues that will happen for a long time. This is an area in which a lot of the global health NGOs have really excelled for some time. Most people don't realize that the vast majority of what we do in global health is already around behavioral change. Our biggest source of funding, our biggest target of funding is HIV. The dominant modes of transmission around HIV are behavioral. They're sex and IV drug use. We've been at the behavior change game for a long time, but we haven't necessarily addressed some of these areas, and I think the NGOs can really help.
With that, about half of the discussion is over, and I wanted to open it up to the audience so you can get your thoughts in, your questions. I would encourage you to raise your hand. Yes. We'll get a microphone to you.
Hi, Jeff Laurenti. On page 37 of the report, and Barbara's already alluded to it, the report makes the case that the U.S. has its own economic interests in trying to deal with this problem. One could argue, however, that there are, within that larger private sector interest, specific private sector interests that in fact may be partially or substantially contributing. One thinks first of tobacco. The Reagan administration had made breaking open markets for tobacco exports one of its top trade priorities, despite predictions that within 30 years you would have lung cancer and heart disease pandemics, which have happened, just as had been predicted. You have the food processing industry, which has been subject to criticism at home to some degree, and here it's the Europeans as much as us, and they have their equivalent to Coca-Cola and KFC, and arguably pharma, the pharmaceutical companies, all of which have used international trade law and investment law as a battering ram for being able to diffuse their products in poorer countries. To what extent do you all see that piece of the wealthier world's very narrow specific industries selling goods with good advertising budgets as part of the problem? To what extent do you think the World Health Organization should be given the authority to override the general trade liberalization provisions in existing law? We note that page 54 refers to Obama's pushing some exemption in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it's WTO and TRIPS that are the the big guarantors.
You know, it's interesting, Jeff, I know Jeff, the problem on tobacco is that tobacco in most of these countries is actually owned by their own government. These are not the BATs or the Philip Morrises, et cetera. They're actually owned. You probably even saw yesterday in the New York Times talking about the e-cigarettes in China and the safety issues there. In particular, it's one of the largest single sources of government funding in China is tobacco. That's true actually in most parts of Africa as well. It's true in India. It's true everywhere. And that actually, you know, you don't want to sit there and feel superior. It's been true everywhere and countries have sold them off. It's within the realm of food. There is not a huge amount in most of these countries of food going in that people are targeting, but most of it, maybe Coca-Cola, certainly the distribution, but most of those guys have been very good about sustainability and sourcing locally. So I think it's important to remember that of course people do want to sell their products, but most of the products that you're talking about are actually being controlled by the self-same governments, and that raises issues of its own in terms of how you can actually make progress on them when it is indeed a source of funding for those governments.
Is there a hypocrisy sort of question when, you know, we're unleashing weapons of mass obesity? Just made that up. Either Tom's?
So I'll just take the trade question on because it's the one I know best. In terms of the task force report, we have a fairly strong recommendation on tobacco and trade, and it was unanimous. This is remarkable in that there were 3 former trade officials on this task force. It was bipartisan, and it makes a recommendation that the announcement that the administration has currently made that they're looking for a potential exception in our trade negotiations on tobacco should encompass the measures provided under U.S. law and provided under international law, specifically the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Nice, strong recommendation. We don't make any recommendation on food or beverages in this area. I think there are good legal and policy reasons why. Tobacco is unusual in that it has an international treaty. It's one of the most widely subscribed treaties in the world, compelling states that have signed on to this treaty to take on these activities. President Clinton issued an executive order compelling U.S. agencies to take a certain approach on tobacco and not to promote tobacco. Tobacco is the only consumer product that, when used as directed, kills you. It's different from food. It's different from the pharmaceutical issues, and both from a policy perspective and from a legal perspective, I think there are very strong grounds for treating it differently under a trade agreement. On the pharmaceutical side, the one thing I would mention in this area, one of the great potential advantages for intervention around NCDs is a lot of these treatments already exist for addressing non-communicable disease, particularly cardiovascular diseases. Treatments for diabetes have existed since the 1920s. These are not, it's by and large at a population level, these aren't issues of patents. These are the vast majority of what needs to be distributed and adapted in these countries is off patent. There's a lot of progress that can be made in this area, and particularly given limited resources. We've talked about how, another way of putting the resource disparities in this area, out of the US's $8 billion global health budget, we spend $10 million on non-communicable diseases. The disparity is similar internationally. Given that kind of disparity, you should focus on where we can make progress soonest.
Do you want to?
Just for 30 seconds, Jeff, you know, we really didn't try to, where we focused on an issue, we wanted to get to an issue where we could do something about it. And with respect to, and didn't engage every potential issue. With respect to tobacco, there are tobacco control regimes which are proven and are effective and are exportable and can make a big difference. And that was the conclusion that the task force reached with respect to tobacco, and endorsed, as you pointed out, the President Mike Froman's exemption in the TPP negotiations. So we didn't engage every potential element here. We tried to focus in on those that were the most important and where, most importantly, we could make a difference. And tobacco, the task force strongly believed was one of those areas.
I see a hand here.
Elizabeth Cafferty, Women's Refugee Commission. Thank you very much for this report. I haven't read the whole thing, but one thing that I didn't see in terms of how this could be used as an advocacy tool really very immediately is the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goal process. And obviously the negotiations are beginning in about a month's time, and the indicators could still be fleshed out. So it would be interesting to hear your thoughts about that. I found it very sort of bilateral focused rather than sort of thinking about international, UN mechanisms, certainly being here in New York. The other thing which I would have hoped to see more of is the data disaggregated by gender, because I think that things would look really different if we had that picture in front of us. And certainly gender norms, there are global gender norms which are shared, but then again, they're different by country and region. And that's going to determine what we talk about for prevention and response when we're designing interventions. And that is certainly a place where both in the post-2015, but then again bilaterally, the U.S. could have, we don't have, I agree, we don't have a sort of coherent global strategy, but certainly the CDC is doing really interesting things on women's health and some reproductive health, and state and AID are obviously involved as well. So if perhaps you could speak to that point as well. Thank you.
You want to talk about that?
I have good news for you.
Yeah.
And when you get to about 2/3 through the report, we do talk about the SDGs, which is, for those of you who don't know, these are the successor goals that will be put in place after the Millennium Development Goals. There are sadly going to be far too many of them. I think by last count, something in the area of 150 or 160. Yes. And one of them will be on non-communicable diseases. One of them is expected to also be on tobacco control. We do talk about the opportunities that provides. We also talk a bit, but probably not enough, about the gender issues around non-communicable diseases. You do see a disproportionate impact, particularly for certain non-communicable diseases, on women and girls, and that's an issue that's talked about in the report, but probably could be talked about more.
And it's one of the specific recommendations on cervical cancer, where there's obviously just a tremendous opportunity there for a big impact.
Right, with the
So-
HPV vaccine,
yes,
which is
exactly.
part of the recommendation.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm Charlie McCormick, President Emeritus of Save the Children. The big numbers amongst the 8 million are in the Philippines, Indonesia, China, India, et cetera, middle-level, middle-income countries. Number one, AID doesn't have a whole lot of expertise in sort of policy change and social change in these middle-income countries. They have very small missions in these particular countries. So drilling down on your recommendations on strategy, given this context in which this problem is lodged, as it were, what additional modifications would you have to recognize that these are countries that have resources and capabilities and research and so on and so forth of their own? Thank you.
So just quickly, you'd be surprised. If we did 49 country case studies of the burden of these diseases, and we focused on US countries that receive 5 million or more annually. We didn't want to do the more, the bigger population countries that receive less. So for instance, China is not in that grouping. And what we found is that in populations 59 or younger, NCDs cause nearly 30% of the deaths in the countries that the US currently targets with its global health programs, and more than 1/3 of the disability in the countries that we currently target in global health programs. For those of you that haven't seen the interactive online, we have those country case studies available, and you'll see low-income countries that it causes more than 40% of the deaths in disability. These are the very same countries that we currently invest in global health. Another way of looking at this is non-communicable diseases cause 3.5 times as much as many premature deaths in those 49 countries than HIV. If you add HIV, malaria, and TB combined, it causes nearly 2 times more premature deaths than those diseases. So these are countries we've been invested in a long time. We have platforms in. We just haven't been invested in these issues. And we're seeing this epidemiological shift in those countries. And the question is how are we going to respond to that? I mean, ultimately, I was at a global health conference, maybe a few months ago on the best buys in global health. And there was a US agency representative there. I won't say the person's name or the agency. But somebody asked about, well, what about cardiovascular disease? This is really cheap. Or what about tobacco control? It's revenue generating in most instances. Why aren't we focusing on that? And the agency representative said, well, I'm interested in the best buys for malaria and HIV. And ultimately, I think this becomes a question of why do we invest in global health? And the justification in most of these issues are not, these diseases aren't direct threats. People are not going to get malaria in the United States because people have malaria in low-income countries. We invest in these diseases because they affect poor people and because we can do something about it. And it improves the welfares of those countries. That's true for non-communicable diseases as well. We just haven't responded to that. So I would just encourage people who haven't looked at the data, you might be surprised.
Yes.
Thank you very much for bringing this report to our attention. I'm Lori Phipps from the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, and in 2011, the General Assembly held a high-level meeting on the prevention and control of NCDs, and all the countries of the world at a high-level, ministerial level or above, signed on to that. And a lot of what you've already discussed is included in the political declaration that was adopted by the GA several years ago. The U.S. approach to that document was to try to keep the emphasis on prevention rather than treatment. Not because we don't want to do treatment, but because it's such an enormous and growing issue to try to treat all the cardiovascular disease or diabetes in the world. Whereas if we can focus on prevention, the burden will be less burdensome. And I'm wondering if you factored into your study the pronouncements of the General Assembly and the World Health Organization on that, and whether when you say that there's no U.S. policy, whether you're looking at a more multi-sectoral approach and looking beyond just the health sector and looking into the sort of sectors that the first questioner mentioned with the food industry and the prevention that can come by better policies in that realm, in tobacco control, which you've already talked about quite a bit, alcohol control, and other efforts to address the risk factors, as the UN calls them. Thank you.
Why don't you start now?
So I would say on, we do, and we all our shovel-ready interventions are prevention. The cardiovascular disease, whether it's around hypertension or primary or secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease, prevention. Tobacco control, obviously, is prevention. The vaccinations and screening programs around cervical cancer and HP, hepatitis B are all prevention. So that you're completely right that this needs to be a focus moving forward. There's no treatment solution to non-communicable diseases. In terms of how it relates to the UN declaration, one of the things we tried to do differently in this report than what was done at the UN, and I think it was an enormously useful exercise that raised the profile of these issues, and as I mentioned before, WHO has been really trying to mobilize attention around non-communicable diseases since the late 80s, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. One of the things we wanted to do a bit different, though, in this task force is we focused on low and middle income countries. And the reason why we did that is because the drivers are different than high income countries. Again, to give you some evidence of this, obesity rates in the United States are more than 4 times higher than they are in low income countries. They're more than almost 3 times higher than they are in lower middle income countries. if you had to focus somewhere in a low-income country on non-communicable diseases, focusing on obesity probably shouldn't be your first stop, given what the data is. That doesn't mean it's not important. It just, again, the drivers are a little bit differently. So that's one of the things that we tried to do to build on the great efforts that have happened at the UN and other settings. In terms of the US policy, it is true we're talking about programs and budgets through global health, but I'm not sure you see a lot in the development area either in this space. There certainly is a fair amount happening domestically, looking at issues of tobacco and nutrition, and part of what that does is provide an opportunity to expand that internationally, but so far that hasn't happened yet. We're hoping to see more.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, in terms of U.S. policy, so I was the National Security Advisor in 2011, and we certainly had to have a position with respect to that meeting, and did. But the United States doesn't have this as a priority right now, and it's reflected in the budget. You cannot say that the United States has as a high priority NCDs and have it be a $10 million project. That's just, I think back on the scale, we're trying to change our focus in Afghanistan, move to a different phase in Afghanistan. During 2011, for example, the year you mentioned, we were spending $10 billion a month in Afghanistan. So the scale here in terms of the real priority and potential impact is really what we wanted to underscore here. And so in terms of, yes, we'll have a position on any given meeting, but we don't have a national strategy, and it's not at the core of our development and global health efforts, I think is the issue. And it's certainly not there in terms of resources. And that's what we're trying to underscore here in the task force report. And it's not, for example, I don't know, and I oversaw for 5 years every one of these meetings, I don't know that we ever had an interagency meeting on NCDs. And one of the things you hope to come forward from a report like this is to have the government begin to look at it on an interagency basis as a priority.
And were you to acquire resources for it, would it be, you think, best distributed in the form of foreign aid, or in what kind of leverage would you bring?
Well, Tom can give some details on this, but there's a variety of ways in which it can be done. But the scale we're talking about here is, I think the figure we used, Tom, remind me, is $236 million is kind of a figure that was spent on tuberculosis last year. Yeah. It's kind of a figure we think would be a figure here that could make progress across the range of the recommendations that we put forward here. Yeah. So this is really not a lot. This is not a lot of money. $236 million would not really be a discussion point in the defense budget.
Yeah. I mean, to give you a sense, so that's still 23 times more than what we spend currently on non-communicable diseases in the United States. So it's not a lot, but it's significantly more than we spend in that area. And we use the tuberculosis threshold to say, here's a global health priority. It's not HIV, which takes up the bulk of the US global health budget, but it's something that we take seriously. How much do we spend in that area? And what the task force said is, if we just spent that much in this area, you could start to really make some progress. It certainly isn't a number, it's a number intended to indicate what the US could do, not what needs to be spent globally and primarily by the governments themselves to address their non-communicable disease problems. So I want to recognize that. And then we had that as a specific threshold, but we also look at the possibility of working with partners, and maybe Barbara wants to say something on the private sector end of what we recommend.
I'll just go back to, I've said it before, which is most major corporations actually are, especially in the last 2 to 3 years, are very focused on wanting to work with NGOs specifically on these types of issues in developing countries. And we're beginning to see elements of that. I know we are, I know several of the major companies I've mentioned, but more than that. And there is a lack of convening on that topic. There's a lot of good intentions, and there is funding. Those organizations will fund and will work. There's also, many mistakes to be made as you go in a learning process. But I know that to be true. That's the entire shared value initiative and discussions on that basis. And and I actually, even just as set aside for my own firm, chair something called the Social Innovation Facility, which is a facility that is set aside to specifically work on issues like that. So, and multiply that by multiple corporations around the world. So there's funding available outside of government, and even more importantly, many of those organizations have access into government for advocacy and access into those markets in a way that can be particularly helpful.
I saw your hand up earlier.
Oops. Yeah. Thank you. I'm Jeff Sturcio with Rabin Martin. I wanted to come back to the question that Lori Phipps raised about the 2011 high-level meeting, and then particularly, Mr. Donnell, on the point you made about how it's clear, just from the evidence, and this report is full of terrific evidence, that NCDs are not a U.S. priority. Now, we've talked a lot about the policy recommendations from the report. They all make perfect sense to those of us who've been involved in this for the last few years. But I want to come to another aspect of this and ask you to just talk a bit, if you would, about the political side of changing those priorities and the allocation of resources. You know, in 2011, the entire world agreed at the UN that NCD should be a priority. All countries would have NCD plans. There would be an NCD global coordination mechanism, blah, you know, on and on and on. There were all these commitments. Well, it's now more than 3 years later. The global coordination mechanism, which was supposed to help ensure that this work went forward, is only now being organized. It has not yet met. It's not actually doing anything yet. And despite the political declaration, that being followed with real resources that would change the situation and make it possible to implement many of the recommendations you've made, just hasn't appeared. So the question really is, if we're going to be serious about this and to find a way to put the recommendations that you've made into practice, what is the political roadmap, both in the US Congress, for instance, and also in the UN bodies, and more importantly, in the national governments, in the parliaments that are going to have to really make, in lower and middle income countries, the tough decisions about where to allocate scarce resources?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, that's one of the impacts you hope a report like this has. And it's interesting, you know, that the makeup of the task force, I think, is important here. You know, you had, as Tom said, you know, we had a number of trade officials, and we came around a unanimous view with respect to the tobacco control regime and the trade issues. You had on this task force not just health experts, but you had 2 former national security advisors, myself and Sandy Berger, trying to look at the national security sides of this. You had people from the private sector and the financial sector. So the goal here, having identified it as an important issue, having dug into the research and the data, and come to the conclusion that it is the most important health issue facing low and moderate income countries, that it can have the kinds of effects that we talked about, including undermining our really successful contagious disease efforts. We would hope to raise this up in terms of the priorities of the U.S. government. That's what these task forces are about. By the way, they're about U.S. policy, and that would be the goal here. And and Tom can talk about some of the interactions that the task force and he will be having with the government to brief on the findings.
Yeah, and we will be doing the range of White House executive branch briefings, congressional briefings, and foreign diplomatic corps that we do really for all task force reports. One thing I want to say in this case, I think the framing is important. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges in 2011 is we looked at this issue globally across all age ranges. The solutions that came out of that, uniformly you would hear about whole of societies approaches being necessary to make progress, whole of governments approaches being necessary to make progress on these issues. Even at the WHO, we're talking about 25, I get them confused. There are 9 goals and 25 indicators. This has been presented as a global problem across all age ranges and something that we need to change agriculture, trade, cities, health systems before you can make progress. And one of the things we've tried to do in this report is actually this looks a lot like a lot of global health issues. It's a problem for the poor, it's a problem for the young working age populations, and it's a problem in the same countries we've invested in other areas. there are really specific targeted things you could do to help slow down the increase of these diseases and help provide those governments times to tackle them themselves. And I think the framing of the issue, the way we've done it, with the data we've done it, we're hopeful in conjunction with having wonderful people like Tom and Barbara say this is important. We're hoping that this it looks different than what's been done on NCDs before.
One of the many traditions at the council is to finish on time. So we're almost out of time, and I wanted to give you both an opportunity to summation, and then we'll call it a day.
All I would say in conclusion on this is, again, this is not an issue that's going away. It's a issue that will continue to increase. We're going to continue to work on it. I want to thank Richard Haas, who has had real interest in this personally, and Chris Tuttle, who led the task force report around this, and the committee for a great effort.
Barbara?
I just appreciate the opportunity of being part of it and to bring a voice to some of the major corporates who want to be part of it as well and be on the team.
You know, let me mention kind of the impact of these kinds of things. So, as many people here know, when you're in the government, you know, the coin of the realm and what you're really sometimes desperate for is good intellectual capital. You know, you have so many things you're dealing with every day, right? You know, and you have this huge inbox, and it's easy to be in government and see the same people all the time who have kind of come up with the same ideas, and you get through your inbox and you get through the problems you're on your desk that day, and you think you've done a good job, but you haven't, because you're just responding. And the impact of things like CFR task forces and really, I mean, powerful intellectual capital that is backed up with data like this, I think is significant. Because again, you're just in the vortex constantly, and fresh intellectual capital coming into the government, challenging ideas, bringing forth new priorities, showing with specificity the ways in which government can act, I think is hopefully a real contribution. I think can change a number of. It certainly did in my time in government, where you would have something that was specific and compelling, implementable, can have a real impact.
That's where thought leadership is invaluable. Thank you so much for contributing to the task force, Chris, everyone else here who took part, and thanks for being with us today. Have a great day.